War was not won only on muddy ground or on blood-stained decks. It was decided, often in strategic silences, and most crucially, thousands of feet up in the air, in the blue vastness of the Pacific, where distance was the enemy's greatest ally in solitude. The burden of every pilot. Japanese air superiority was established for a time as an unquestionable truth. Over the Solomon Islands, the Zero A6M, a symbol of agility and terrifying range, dictated the rules of engagement. It was an almost mythical machine, capable of outmaneuvering everything the Allies could throw against it in the early stages. Allied pilots, flying less capable aircraft, faced a constant dilemma, not just to defeat the enemy, but to survive a machine that seemed to defy the very laws of aerodynamics. It was a battle that began with a moral disadvantage, an invisible weight accompanying every takeoff. The air of Guadalcanal, the key to the entire archipelago, smelled of burnt metal and palpable anxiety. The daily cost of defending Henderson Field. The South Pacific Theater was a vast arena of tropical islands and unforgiving skies. Following the shock of Pearl Harbor and the strategic turning point of Midway, the fight focused on the Guadalcanal campaign, where the capture and defense of a single airfield evolved into a prolonged and brutal war of attrition. For the Japanese, the Rabaul base in New Britain functioned as the heart of their air offensive, for which Zeros flew attack and patrol missions that spanned nearly 1,000 kilometers. The loyalty of Japanese pilots to their machine was absolute, and their technique, a mixture of aggression and almost ritualistic precision. The enemy was not just Imperial Japan, but the relentless logistics of distance and fragility of early American fighters, such as the P-39 and P-40, which were frequently outclassed and shot down by lighter, more maneuverable aircraft. The Allies needed something that combined range, speed, and firepower. They needed a new kind of warrior for the sky. It was in this scenario of escalating pressure that the Lockheed P-38 Lightning began to appear in significant numbers, an aircraft of unmistakable design. With its twin boom and twin engines, it was initially viewed with suspicion. It was heavy, complex, and demanded a new type of pilot. But the P-38 carried something its predecessors lacked: the necessary range to escort bombers to Rabaul and concentrated firepower in its nose, a lethal burst that could disintegrate a target in seconds. Its dive speed was legendary, capable of leaving behind any Zero that attempted to keep up in a vertical pursuit. Gradually, the arrogance of Japanese pilots began to give way to forced caution. The arrival of the P-38 was not just equipment replacement. It was the introduction of a new moral dilemma into the theater of war. For the first time, the Allies were not merely reacting. They had a tool to strike at the roots of enemy air power. The machine, however revolutionary, still depended on the man. An aerial warfare in the Pacific, with extremely long-range missions over the open sea, elevated fear and solitude to unbearable levels. There was nowhere to go if an engine failed. There were no friends to wave to if you had to bail out. There was only the water, blue and indifferent, and the certainty of an ending that rarely meant rescue. Between carrying out orders to fly extreme distances and the awareness of the real risk of not returning, many pilots discovered that the hardest war was the one fought inside the aluminum cockpit. Fear disguised itself as discipline, but in the solitude of the flight, it was the only silent companion. The turning point, which for the general public remains an isolated event, was actually a long process of attrition and technological change. But if we can pinpoint a single moment that summarized the P-38's new supremacy and its psychological impact, we must look to a mission plan with almost unthinkable audacity: Operation Vengeance. On that cold dawn in April 1943, an intercepted telegram would change the course of the war and, terribly, the fate of one man. Magic, the American code-breaking system, had intercepted a message detailing the flight itinerary of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Japanese regime's chief naval strategist. The Admiral was scheduled for an inspection flight from Rabaul to an airfield on Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. The distance was extreme, the interception time exact, and the risk of compromising Magic incalculable. The decision to approve the mission was an ethical and strategic dilemma of immense proportions. The Allies asked, do we have the right to plan an assassination no matter how crucial the target? And, more urgently, Does loyalty to the security of the intelligence source outweigh the opportunity to decapitate the enemy command? The civilized world pondered, but wars always impose its cold logic. The mission was assigned to the 339th Fighter Squadron. Only the P-38, with auxiliary fuel tanks, had the necessary range. From Cookham Field on Guadalcanal, a flight of 16 Lightnings took off for the longest aerial interception mission in history. They flew low, skimming the waves to avoid radar detection, turning the ocean into a potential invisible tomb. For P-38s were designated for the attack and 12 for cover, a flight of over 2.5 hours, right at the limit of endurance, where every minute was a calculation of fuel, wind, and faith. The aircraft was no longer just a machine. It was an umbilical cord stretched between life and oblivion. At the precise moment and over the humid jungle of Bougainville, the group sighted the Betty bombers and their Zero escorts. The accuracy of American intelligence was chilling. The encounter was not a coincidence, but an appointment set by cryptography and determination. The battle lasted only a few dizzying minutes. The Lightnings dived relentlessly, concentrating their fire on the bomber carrying Yamamoto. Throughout the war, the truth fragmented into short diaries and transmissions. Every record is an echo of conscience, a vestige of generation that lived the unspeakable with simple words. In a hastily scribbled memo, which would be declassified decades later, an intelligence cryptographer wrote, "The risk of the operation was 100%. The source cannot be compromised. When intercepted truth saves more lives than ignored truth, conscience is a heavy burden. We acted in the darkness to defend the light. This is the solitude of the Cold War, the invisible war of the mind. Those who break the codes carry an even greater moral burden than soldiers on the front line. They decide, at the point of a pen, who lives and who dies, without ever seeing the faces of their victims." From a letter from a veteran P-38 pilot to his wife, which was never sent. "The P-38 is the only thing that allows me to go and return. In the cockpit, fear is not the enemy, but the compass. The machine shakes, but I know the extra engine is my only prayer on the way back." The duality of the machine, its twin body, was the very metaphor for survival in the Pacific. One engine failed, and the pilot had a chance. Hope was not based on bravery, but on engineering. Fear turned into calculation. Faith, statistics. A field mechanic at Cookham Field scrawled in a notebook next to an engine diagram. "We learned to distinguish the sound of hope from the sound of return. That subtle boom in the distance. If it's a lightning with both engines, the night is a little quieter." When even silence becomes audible, we realize that the human is dissolving into primary sounds. The engine roaring, the bomb dropping, and the sound of salvation. A pilot's return was the only victory over the nihilism of war. From a diary of a civilian survivor in Rabaul, found in a bunker after the surrender. "Today, the bell rang early. It wasn't a church bell. It was the sound of the Zero falling over the bay. They said the Admiral wouldn't return. Even in the darkness, humanity creates rituals to remember itself. It is the final act of resistance, to feel the change, even if it's the change on our side of the sky." The bell ringing was the certainty of the turning tide, the premonition of an end. For those under the regime, the news of a leader's death was, simultaneously, mandatory mourning and the first crack in the wall of certainty, the seed of doubt about invincibility. Yamamoto's bomber crashed into the dense jungle of Bougainville. The loss of the strategist was a paralyzing shock, a wound to the moral and strategic spine of the Japanese regime, far more devastating than the loss of ships or planes. It was a climax of Operation Vengeance, and the price of the enemy's loyalty. On the American side, Lieutenant Rex Barber and Lieutenant Thomas Lanford Jr. emerged as executors of one of the coldest and most surgical missions of the war. One P-38 was lost, that of Lieutenant Raymond Hine, who disappeared at sea, an immediate reminder that vengeance carried a human cost. That single act, the elimination of Yamamoto, did not win the war, but it symbolized the end of Japanese air dominance over the Solomon Islands. The P-38, with its superior speed and range, had become the long-distance escort fighter the Allies desperately needed, undermining the Zero's dominance and allowing the Cactus Air Force to move from defense to attack. The impact went beyond tactics. It was psychological. Japanese pilots could no longer rely solely on maneuverability. They had to look at the sky with new apprehension, aware that in a dive, they would be outmatched. The balance of the war definitively tipped when arrogance gave way to forced respect. The demise of Admiral Yamamoto was a signal, a clarion call that broke through the fog of invincibility. But air supremacy is not achieved with a single act of precision, however audacious. It is consolidated by the relentless routine of attrition and the sustained power of logistics. After Operation Vengeance, the P-38 Lightning, once a promising novelty, became the central element of a strategy of strangulation. Its presence in the skies of the Solomons, now in increasing numbers and with pilots increasingly adapted to its peculiarities, began to change the equation irreversibly. The Lightning could carry auxiliary tanks to escort bombers to Rabaul and return, a capability the Zero simply could not match without completely sacrificing its maneuverability in combat. The air over the Japanese bases grew heavier, not with monsoon clouds, but with uncertainty. With every successful escort mission, with every bomber that reached its target under the guard of the P-38's twin tails, the Japanese operational capability was systematically eroded. The Zero, still lethal in low-speed dogfights, was forced to face a fighter that dictated the rules of engagement. The P-38 used its speed, especially at high altitudes, to hit and run, a tactic that annihilated the Japanese combat philosophy, based on persistence and tight maneuvering. The American aircraft did not need grace. It needed firepower and energy, and that is exactly what Kelly Johnson's design provided. The myth of the Zero began to disintegrate, not in a dramatic explosion, but in the slow and painful decline of effectiveness. Aerial warfare, more than any other, is a test of morale, and this technological and tactical shift had a profound psychological cost for both sides. For American pilots, the acquisition of a fighter capable of fighting on equal terms transformed anxiety into confidence, even if the risk remained brutal. The fear of death became a calculated risk, not an imminent certainty. The P-38 was, metaphorically, the shield that allowed them to fight for the first time without the weight of inferiority. But the impact was devastating for the Japanese aviators. They had trained under belief that their fighting spirit, coupled with their machine's technical superiority, was invincible. Seeing their Zero, once feared, repeatedly surpassed by a heavy and complex machine undermined the foundation of their doctrine. The problem was not just the loss of aircraft, which the Japanese industry already struggled to replace, but the irretrievable loss of veteran pilots, trained in a time-consuming, high-quality system. Every Zero shot down took years of experience with it, while the Allied training system, robust and industrialized, replaced its losses with alarming speed. The war of attrition in the Solomons became, for Japan, a slow bleed of human capital that could not be stanched. It is impossible to discuss the P-38 without mentioning the genius that spawned it. The Lightning was the manifestation of the American belief that technology, and not just mystique, would win the war. Its twin-engine design was not merely redundancy for survival over the ocean. It was a solution to the chronic problem of the single-engine fighters of the era. By placing an engine in each boom and concentrating the armament in the center, the aircraft achieved phenomenal dive speed and eliminated the need to synchronize machine guns to the propeller, ensuring unparalleled concentration of fire. The key to its high-altitude success, crucial for supremacy over the long Pacific crossings, lay in the turbo superchargers. While the Japanese philosophy prioritized lightweight and extreme maneuverability, sacrificing pilot comfort and armor, Lockheed invested in supercharged engines. This engineering detail allowed the Lightning to maintain its performance at heights where the Zero wilted. The ascent of the P-38 was, in essence, the triumph of the doctrine that valued pilot safety, with armor and twin engines, range with massive tanks, and advanced technology. The war in the Solomons became above all a race between elegant lightness and raw, protected power. Lockheed's engineering decision survived the pilot's moral dilemma. The drama of the air war was lived in 16 cubic inches of a cockpit, but the real epic lay on the ground. Behind the roar of the P-38's engines was a legion of anonymous men, mechanics, radio operators, and field logisticians. On islands overwhelming with heat and mud, their work was a continuous act of resistance against the environment and time. Spare parts traveled thousands of miles, crossing vulnerable supply lines. Every tire changed, every twin Wasp engine overhauled, was an act of faith in the mission. The conditions were brutal. Salt corrosion, humidity, and the constant attack of insects and enemy forces turned maintenance into a form of combat. These men, without the glory of flight, were the true guardians of supremacy. The P-38 was a complex, demanding machine, and mechanics often worked under the scorching sun or night fire in a silent race against the next takeoff deadline. The emotional wear of the returning pilot was matched by the physical exhaustion of the team that put him back in the air. The victory in the Solomons was won by the American capacity to sustain their aircraft in inhospitable environments, to make cold metal fly day after day, where the enemy, due to lack of parts and logistics, was forced to land permanently. The Solomon Islands campaign and the ascent of the Lightning in its sky was not just a battle. It was a laboratory where the rest of the Pacific War would be tested. What was learned there about long-range escort, about the need for twin-engine planes for operations over the vast ocean, about the value of armor and dive speed, formed the blueprint for the island-hopping strategy that followed. The P-38 proved, beyond doubt, that air superiority was the absolute prerequisite for success on land and sea. The Lightning's legacy in the Solomons resides not just in Operation Vengeance, but in its routine and obstinate presence, which allowed B-25 and B-17 bombers to work with relative impunity. It set the escort standard the B-29 would later need over Japan. The duel between the P-38 and the Zero transcended the individual kill marks. It became a clash of industrial and cultural philosophies, in which mass production capability and technological innovation proved stronger than individual skill. The war became impersonal, and the plane a piece in a vast mechanism of numbers and statistics. Operation Vengeance, and the systematic subsequent deployment of the Lightning in the Pacific skies, offers us a profound lesson today, not about glorious triumph, but about the cost of strategic precision and the impersonal nature of modern warfare. Admiral Yamamoto was a man of culture and intelligence, but on the chessboard of total war, he was reduced to a target of exact timing and precise coordinates. The P-38 Lightning, the machine that brought him down, was a materialization of American industrial capability and technological primacy. But fundamentally, it was a triumph of intelligence over isolated bravery, of logistics over fanaticism. What the event teaches us about humanity is that courage often resides not in fervent combat, but in the discipline of flying at the limit of physics and emotion, in the silent execution of an almost suicidal mission. It teaches us that faith can be trusted in two engines, and that blind obedience is always confronted by the ethics of the result. The P-38 was not a knight. It was a tool, cold and effective, that brought the shock of realism to a conflict that previously seemed doomed to tactical stalemate. Today, when we look at the faded photographs of that twin-tailed fighter, what we see is not just metal and speed. We see a symbol of the turning point, a watershed moment that marked the transition of the Pacific War. The P-38 Lightning was not the prettiest plane, but it was the most necessary, the cold and pragmatic answer to a formidable enemy. It embodied the idea that, in times of conflict, technology is a moral judgment. It defines what is possible and what is fatal. The wreckage of the Betty bomber still lies in the Bougainville jungle, consumed by humidity and silence. The twisted fuselage, amidst the dense green, is a monument not to the glory of aviation, but to the certainty of consequence. The characteristic sound of its engine, the synchronized roar, became the sound of hope for the Allies and the harbinger of defeat for Japan. The engines have fallen silent forever, but the echo of the choices made on that dawn still resonates in humanity's memory. The Lightning did not just end Japanese air dominance. It revealed that the enemy, however legendary, was mortal. The sky became a place of quality and, finally, the stage for the inevitable American ascent in the Pacific. Snow never fell on the tropical jungles of the Solomons, but the weight of the decisions made in that sky still echoes. The Lightning is gone, retired by the jet age, but its shadow, cast over the waters of the Solomons, remains as a definitive marker of the end of an era of dominance and the birth of another, more complex and industrial. The sky, once dominated by one machine, now belonged to the doctrine of power and range. And in that new sky, the Japanese mystery and invincibility fell silent forever,